Well, I'm glad you gave that little introduction as to how this question came about, because I confess, as I got closer and closer to this day and having to present, I thought, first of all, oh my gosh, what a fantastic and grandiose topic that is. And it's just way too big to tackle. So I felt really daunted by that. But I'm going to do my best. And even though my background is social psychology and cognitive psychology, as you can maybe tell from the title, I'm actually not going to talk about those things that I know the most. I'm going to talk a little bit about neuroscience and a little bit about evolutionary theory and psychology, and hopefully invite some audience participation. You know, ask a question. When Dr. Wright says she left the back door open, I thought that wasn't for unobtrusive entrance so much as unobtrusive exit. I will not take offense if you take off. The other thing, and maybe this is a little bit of self-handicapping on my part, my day started at 1 a.m. this morning, when suddenly lying on my bed I woke up and looked up and saw a bat flying around my bedroom. So after some courage mustering and catching and killing a bat as best I couldn't really fall back asleep. So I'm walking around here on fumes and caffeine right now, and I'm sorry if I have some brain glitches in the process. Let me begin by just saying one of the reasons I agreed to do this talk is that I thought, well, of course, psychology and social scientists, we should have something to say about human suffering and how to understand it, and maybe even how to relieve it and reduce it from time to time. I'm going to give you a quote from Lewis Thomas, a famous biologist and author. He said, "The social scientists have a long way to go to catch up, but they may be up to the most important scientific business of all, if and when they finally get around to asking the right questions. Our behavior toward each other is the strangest, most unpredictable, and almost entirely unaccountable of all the phenomena of which we are obliged to live." And if nothing else, I think we can all agree that in all of nature there is nothing so threatening to humanity as humanity itself. We're at the top of the food chain. We're our own worst enemies. And I think what I'm here to talk about is what may be sort of hardwired into us a little bit that makes us keep getting in each other's way and causing our biggest problems. At the time that Dr. Fleming called me up and asked about this, I'd been reading a few books and rereading some parts, and so I kind of said, sure. And as you could tell, the first book, Brain Bugs, which is written by a neuroscientist at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, I kind of borrowed a lot from just the title of my talk, and actually you'll see I owe a lot to his content as well. And I've been reading some other books and rereading them. These are books, by the way, I'm recommending to you. They're written for the masses. They're great reads, but they're almost all, except with the exception of Jonah Lehrer's book, How We Decide, all written by the scientists who are well-known names and accomplished scholars in their field. But Jonah Lehrer is a very well-known scientific writer as well. Good books, so put that on your wish list, Amazon.com or whatever. Christmas is coming up. When you hear the word human suffering, what comes to mind? What do you think of? There was quite a litany that she sort of gave you. But when you think of human suffering, other than final exams, what comes to mind for you? Oh, this is the part where I see I ask a question, and you're supposed to maybe answer. Yes?
Like pain and death.
Pain, death. Now, I don't know how much we suffer in death, but I guess we'll find out.
Yeah,
but yes, kind of the worst things that we can think of, pain and misery. Anything else?
Starving.
Starvation, famine.
Like diseases.
Diseases. That goes along with pain, I would guess. Anything else? Okay, maybe this talk will be on that list before you're over. Here's my working definition. Human suffering is a state of deprivation in which our basic needs as human beings are not met. Now the question is, what are those basic needs that are not met? And I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm not going to come up with some scheme that no one else has ever thought of. But here's some things that I often thought of when I was coming up with this talk. I thought of famine, disease, war, violence. But I would add a couple of others that are not so much physical pains, but maybe psychological pains. Loneliness, ostracism, feelings of worthlessness. I mean, people commit suicide. They would rather die than not have social connections, not feel a degree of self-worth. Well, for those of you who have ever had an introductory psychology class, you'll probably recognize this. Abraham Maslow came up with what he called the hierarchy of needs. And he would start at the bottom here of the pyramid and say physiological needs are the ones that are most basic. Things like hunger, thirst, etc. You've got to satisfy these in order to concern yourself with safety needs, feeling secure, avoiding pain, etc. Then the things that we think of in terms of belonging, needing love and affection, friendship. And then a sense of self-worth, self-esteem is also important. And then at the very highest point of the pyramid is that idea of being the ultimate person that you can possibly be, living up to your full potential, what he would call self-actualization. Now, not surprisingly, a lot of the things we were listing map onto this. Things like famine map onto our basic physiological needs, safety needs. When that's violated, we feel threatened by crime and war and violence. When we lack social connections, we feel those social losses like loneliness, ostracism. And when we feel a lack of esteem, we feel worthless and depressed. Okay. So I'm not going to reinvent that. That's there. That's kind of a starting point. But this doesn't really necessarily tell us where all this happens. And I started thinking about where is the greatest suffering in the world. And I looked at this map, and I think it's a nice visual summary of maybe where we can see the greatest suffering just by looking at average life expectancy. You see that Africa, the average life expectancy is right around 50 or less in some countries. North America seems to be around 75. Australians and Japanese, looks like Spain, they're living up into their 80s on average. But Africa seems to be a place of very relatively short lifespan. And Africa is home to over 1 billion people. That's 15% of the world's population. So a lot of suffering seems to be going on there, potentially. Disease is also implicated there when you look at maps of HIV infection. Here's one from a few years ago. It ranges from the northern tier, very low levels of less than 1% of the adult population having HIV/AIDS, to the southern part of Africa where as much as 15 to 30% can have that infection. So it's a huge problem in sub-Saharan Africa where the average is something like 5% of the adult population has HIV/AIDS. Of the world's population, with 33 million, estimated a couple years ago now, 33 million people living with HIV and AIDS, 2/3 of that comes from sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of newly infected, it's about 70% of the people newly infected are coming from that area. And in terms of death, it's about 72%. So this place is rampant with suffering. And I just wanted you to kind of have a picture of that. And we see also when we look at this area, it's associated with malnutrition, food shortages, and these little stars represent all kinds of war and conflict, whether it be interstate or intrastate civil wars or ethnic conflicts. This place is a mess. I mean, it's really kind of tragic to see one of the largest continents and such a huge segment of the world's population suffering like this. So what does this have to do with psychology and what I'm here to talk about? Well, what are the brain glitches that lead to human suffering? And I think there's a lot of them, and I'm going to focus on 3. I'm going to take a very small bite of this list that you guys saw. And I'm going to point out 3 things that I think are basic kinds of problems that are built into how our operating system up here is wired up. One is fear. And fear, as it turns out, is probably a perfectly normal and adaptive thing to have. That's why it's wired in there in the first place. But it also is one of the things that, when it seems inappropriate, when it gets out of hand, leads to a lot of the problems that I will talk about. A second is that despite the fact that we are really gifted relative to every other species on the planet at figuring out cause and effect, as far as I know, we're the only species that has science, right? We actually study these things in systematic ways. We're very poor at it. We misperceive cause and effect all the time. And the third thing is, because we're at the top of the food chain, because we have this incredible brain, and we're getting to the point now where we're studying that brain, there's a bit of self-conceit, I think, built into us. We get an idea, we think we figured it out, and we are loath to let go of what we think is an answer. And again, I think that's part of our operating system, built into us. All right, so that's a little bit of a map of where I hope to go. Here's some questions, first of all. What are you afraid of? I mean really afraid of. Not getting a B on your final exam. But what would really cause you to feel panic, strong fear? I think fear is a very powerful motivating force. Think about people who have a fear of flying, for example. And a lot of people developed a fear of flying without ever being in a plane crash, right? They had a fear of flying perhaps after 9/11. People started driving. It's a powerful motivating force. It can cause people to change their behavior in various ways. They might choose to live in a gated community if they fear crime. They might choose to avoid a whole class of people that they associate with crime. It's a powerful effect. So think about the things that you're really afraid of, that you might behave differently in response to. The question I want to turn to, though, is having to do with, is this part of our operating system, our neural operating system? Is fear innate, or is it learned? And you're going to see I'm going to wander a lot. This is going to be a weird talk, probably because I'm bringing in from a lot of different odd sources. But hopefully by the end you'll see some kind of coherence to this. Now, this is a group of rhesus monkeys. You guys recognize them? They're all huddled together. They're very cute. They're very family and socially oriented. They nurture their young just like we nurture our young in many ways. And it used to be the case that people thought, well, of course, monkeys have an innate fear of certain things. They probably do not have an innate fear of this, right? Just colored blocks. And you're right, they don't. How about that? No? I'm not particularly afraid of flowers either. I doubt my cousins are. But that probably is something I would be afraid of. Now the question that scientists ask when thinking about are monkeys afraid of snakes seems like a pretty simple one. All we have to do is look at their behavior. And we went out into the wild and we looked at wild monkeys. We exposed them to a snake, and not surprisingly, they acted very afraid. So it looks like, wow, these monkeys must be innately afraid of snakes. But the interesting observation is if you go to captive environments, places where they have monkeys that were never raised except in captivity, you'll find that they are not afraid of snakes that much. So there doesn't seem to be this innate fear. So what explains the difference between the wild monkey and, say, the captive monkey? Well, a researcher by the name of Susan Minicott, I think is how you say her name, but a clinical psychologist at Northwestern University, got interested in all kinds of issues having to do with fear and phobias, and began doing some kind of primate studies, looking at these monkeys. And she got some wild monkeys, and she got some captively raised monkeys, and she exposed them to those blocks, and to flowers, and to snakes, and found that, guess what? None of the captive monkeys were afraid of any of those things. Only the wild monkeys were afraid of snakes. So she had this idea that maybe what's happening in the wild is that the monkeys are kind of teaching their other monkeys to be afraid of snakes. So, as weird as this sounds, she had the monkeys watching a video of another monkey who had been trained to be afraid of snakes. Okay? You can train people through classical conditioning to be afraid of snakes. If you've ever heard of the Little Albert study, anybody know Little Albert? He was classically conditioned to be afraid of all kinds of things, from fuzzy white rabbits to a Santa Claus mask to a little white rat, just by pairing it with something really aversive, a loud noise. Well, you can train a monkey through classical conditioning to be afraid of just about anything, including colored blocks, flowers, etc. So they took a monkey who watched another monkey be afraid of a snake or be afraid of a flower that had been trained to fear flowers. And the interesting thing is after having to watch a video, seems really odd. I guess just like us, they're kind of attracted to technology and moving pictures just like we are. They looked at how long it would take for the monkey to reach across, say, a toy snake or a flower or a colored block to reach for a really desirable treat. And the longer it takes, the more hesitant they are, the more fear they are showing. Well, if you look at what they were doing beforehand, they were not very hesitant at all, whether it was the flower or the snake. But after watching the video, what they found is that, you know what, no matter even if they see a monkey being afraid of the flower, they don't pick that up. They're not going to hesitate. They're going to reach right over the flower and grab the tree. But the ones that watched some monkey friend of theirs in the video be afraid of a snake became much more hesitant, much more fearful in their behavior. So it's not so much that fear is innate, but we are predisposed to learn to fear certain things. So it's wired into us, apparently, to fear certain things, to have a fearful response under the right kinds of learning conditions. And all it takes is to see somebody else be afraid, and we can imitate that. We're very imitative creatures, whether we're rhesus monkeys or human beings. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Any questions about that before I move on? You're probably thinking, what the heck is this guy talking about? Right? Okay. All right. So, what are you afraid of? It turns out that we're very poor judges of what to be afraid of. I think it's fair to say that a lot of people were extremely concerned after 9/11 about terrorism, or after some major crime spree, about crime. But look at the kind of statistics that we have, say, in this 10-year period from 1995 to 2005. 3,200 people died due to acts of terrorism in the United States. 7,000 people died due to weather-related things like floods and lightning and hurricanes, etc. 180,000 people died from murder. 300,000 from suicide. 450,000 from auto fatalities. There were approximately 1 million smoking-related deaths and 6 million deaths related to heart disease. Now, compare that to what we get really preoccupied with at any given moment. In 2001, which apparently was a really bad year for terrorism, not only did we have the attacks on the World Trade Center and the like, but there was also an anthrax scare. 5 people died because they were exposed to anthrax spores in letters. $5 billion was spent updating our security system for those, and the letter system and the like, in response to that. We spent only $2 billion in federal funds addressing heart disease. 5 people died from the anthrax things. It turned out not to be terrorism from outside, but one kind of nutty government employee that was involved. And we could have solved it a lot more simply just by closing down our own labs that make anthrax. And it's not a very good bioweapon anyway. But we spent way less on the thing that causes way more suffering. So we're poor judges of what to be afraid of, but we are wired to fear. Why are we wired to fear something like bioterrorism or people, bombing the World Trade Center rather than climbing into your car and driving to school? Yes?
Well, I think just looking at the statistic right there, I would look to see at the 1 million to 6 million mark, even 450,000 auto fatalities, and say that those are things that we can control more than, say, the terrorism and the weather and the murders.
Yeah, control definitely figures into it, but think about climbing onto an airplane. How many accidents for an airplane have happened due to terrorism as opposed to due to mechanical failures, which are equally uncontrollable as a passenger? So it can't be just that. It would be my argument.
With the heart disease, you can actually, for the most part, if you're smoking and whatnot, that's something you can physically control.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong, but I think there are some other things. Why we fear certain things more than others. Why we fear, for example, and worry more about murders than about suicides as a country, you know, in terms of social policy? Why aren't we doing more to kind of prevent suicides than worrying about crime on the streets? You know, think about what politicians talk about. They talk about the things that have to do with those violent acts rather than kind of that self-inflicted harm. Julie?
Are we more afraid of other people than we are of ourselves?
Well, I think that's where the evolutionary part comes into play. I think we are wired to fear acts of aggression. I mean, I think that's what, when you think about intruders, when you think of strangers, when you think of attacks from others, that would be true throughout our evolutionary history. And I think that's sort of what we're most wired to fear. Even though now we live in an environment where lots of other things are more damaging to us than were, say, 100,000 years ago. We probably had more to fear from a neighboring tribe thousands of years ago than we do today, but that's not what our brain is preoccupied with. Yes, sir?
I have a question. How do you correlate the amount of money we spend on protecting from terrorism to we fear that the most?
Well, I think that's it's a good question, but I think that's a reflection of what we as a society say we worry about the most, where we think the most need is to address that. Do you think that's badly correlated to look at the money amount as opposed to?
Oh, I was just wondering, like, because you're talking about fear, and okay, yes, we do fear terrorism, but why? Why do we fear terrorism the most?
I think because it was particularly shocking, because it was particularly invasive. We fear violence more than we fear things like automobiles. Now that you're afraid of flying, you know, people basically said, oh, I can't get on an airplane because there might be terrorists on there, or I'm just afraid of heights, who knows which. And they decide to drive and take the actually more risky option. But they're operating on what their gut, their emotion is dictating is most bothersome to them. But in fact, a rational look at it would say, and in fact the evidence suggests that we probably lost more than 3,200 lives just by the number of people who switched from air travel to car travel following 9/11. I mean, it was statistically much more likely to happen that there's just going to be more people dying now on the roads than were dying in planes. So there's a certain disconnect between our emotions and what seems to be worthy of being afraid of.
So the more like accustomed we are to it, the less we fear it.
Well, here's kind of the bottom line where I'm eventually going to go. Our brains are built for a world that we don't live in anymore, right? Our brains are pretty much wired up the same way they were 60,000, 100,000 years ago. And our world doesn't look anything like that anymore. I mean, think about just texting and driving. You've heard that, you're not supposed to text and drive. Your brain is wired up in terms of how your visual system works, how your attention works, to function as if you were just walking around. It's built for pedestrian speeds, essentially. Well, guess what? If somebody's coming at me, walking towards me on the street or in the woods or what have you, and my attention gets diverted for a moment, and we collide, big deal. I got a headache at worst. But if your attention gets diverted for a fraction of a second going 60 miles an hour, you could either kill somebody or kill yourself in the process. So whether you're in an airplane or in a car, we're operating with stuff that we've created that we're not built to handle. And I think the same thing happens when we look at our emotions. Our emotions are built for a time and a world that we don't currently exist in. We've built a completely different environment that's much more complex, much more interdependent. And we're afraid of things that are really kind of what we should have been afraid of in a much earlier time. Okay, so keep that in mind. I think one of the biggest things that relate to a lot of the stuff we're talking about, whether it be war, whether it be famine, etc., is xenophobia. We are afraid of out-groups. We are afraid of people who are different from us, partly because of the survivability notion that it was wise for us in our evolutionary history not to trust strangers. Not to trust them, because we're competing for food, we're competing for access to mates, we're competing for shelter, etc. Trusting strangers, taking care of people that are in our group was extremely important. But now, because we live in such an interdependent world, that's not so important. And now, how do we decide who's in our group and who's not when you live in a city of 1 million people? I can tell right now how you tell. Get your Creighton sweatshirt on. It says UNL. Oops, sorry. Not one of us. Metro. Oh, give me a break. No. UNL. No, you're not one of us. Get off campus. Or just what fraternity and sorority you got advertised. Or what skin color they are. What religion they are. We have all different kinds of ways now of deciding who's in and who's out. And we're still obsessed with that idea of we got to identify who we can trust. It's adaptive to a point. If you think about it, there is a class of people who suffer, if you can call it that, a complete absence of stereotyping and fear of outgroups. There's a group of people who have what is called Williams syndrome. And there's an abnormality in terms of their emotional centers of their brain, where they trust everybody. They love everybody. It is a phenomenally beautiful thing, but it is terrifying as a parent. I mean, think of this. They will climb into anybody's car. Hey, we're going to Disneyland or Dairy Queen. I want to go to Disneyland. I love you. You know, and climb into their car. No, we needed a certain degree of fear in the way our societies are structured. But we obviously go way overboard in regards to this. Okay, let me switch gears here rather abruptly. Misperception of cause and effect. I think it's fair to say that human beings are intensely curious, that we're constantly searching for cause and effect relationships, and we seem to be better at this than any other species on the planet. I mean, look at what we have built, from cathedrals to rocket ships that take us to the moon to computers. We have figured out how to make things work. We figured out the laws of physics and chemistry and biology, and we are amazingly good at creating science and technology, to the point where we can transplant organs, manipulating ourselves as well as the world around us. So we got stuff figured out. But despite all that, despite the amazing accomplishments, I'm going to say we are still surprisingly bad at this. And let me give you a couple of examples. Consider the real-life example of the illusion of cause. We think we know what the cause of something is, and because of that, it can lead us astray. I bring this up in one of my classes this semester, my social psychology class, talking about the measles outbreak. It's the largest this year in 10 years. The thing about measles is kind of interesting because although there's a very graphic image of what it looks like, be glad you don't have it, here are some of the symptoms. High fever, rash, coughing, sneezing. It is highly infectious. I mean, you can catch it just through air transmission, just through touch of someone who's come in contact with it. It can have very severe complications like pneumonia, encephalitis, chronic neurological deficits, even death in 2 out of 1,000 cases. In lesser developed parts of the world with poor health service, it is still a very big problem. But not in the United States and most of the Western world. It was almost completely eradicated. That's how good we are at figuring things out. So, before the measles vaccine was licensed in 1963, my lifetime, we had 3 to 4 million cases each year in the United States. In 1983, because we had developed this vaccine, it was down to around 1,500 reported cases in the United States. In 2004, just 37 in the entire United States. Measles was nearly eradicated, and now it's starting to come back. We're losing ground. That doesn't make sense. And you know why we're losing ground? Because people won't get vaccinated. That's stupid. And I'm going to be blunt about it. We have a cure for this practically, and people won't do it because, and you've probably heard this idea, they think that the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine causes autism. They've heard that, oh, you get vaccinated, you could have an autistic child if that child gets the vaccine. What's going on? What led to this notion? Well, a study published by, quote-unquote, an expert, a doctor, studying 12 people, mind you, in a nevertheless well-respected medical journal, basically made this horrific kind of assessment. Yes, this is an anti-vax kind of picture, showing these really kids like, ah, it's a horrible thing. Vaccines and deaths are correlated. And they try to point out it's got all this stuff that sounds really bad, like mercury and formaldehyde, monkey kidney and lung cells and human fetal tissue and aspartame, anything they can throw in there that sounds horrific. And then, of course, it helps to have not only some quote-unquote expertise, but maybe a public spokesperson like Jenny McCarthy, whose fame has to do more with looking pretty and not wearing enough clothing. And she had a son, tragically, who had been diagnosed as autistic. She got on this bandwagon that somehow there was a connection. Why would any parent think there was a connection? Well, the symptoms of autism really don't appear until after the age of 2 to up to around the age of 4 or 5. Coincidentally, that's about the time that they're getting this vaccine. So our sophisticated mental machinery latches onto vaccine, followed by autism. They must be related. They must be cause and effect. Well, it sounds like a plausible hypothesis, and by the way, I'm not going to click on this, but if you want to go to JennyMcCarthyBodyCount.com, it'll tell you how many people have gotten ill or sick or even died from preventable illnesses, despite the fact that it seems like a very loaded thing. The data there come from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta here in the United States. But there's a lot of stuff there. The doctor who published that article, by the way, is no longer a doctor. His license was stripped because it turns out he committed fraud. He had not only a conflict of interest in trying to come up with another vaccine, he fabricated some data. And despite that, there are people, lots and lots of people, willing to say, no, he was right. He was right. It's this evil pharmaceutical companies that are wrong. And this is despite the fact there have been study after study after study now that have shown that there is no discernible connection between autism and this particular vaccine. But once you get an idea in your head, it tends to get rooted in. It tends to just plant and dig deep roots. And this is true for scientists as well as for the average person. It's hard to get an idea out of our heads once it's there. Why do you think that's the case? Because if you could figure this out, I'd really like to know. We seem to, yeah, Roger.
I think it gets back to the control thing. If we can identify a cause and effect, no matter how illogical it is, it gives us a sense that, well, then we don't vaccinate our child and they don't get autism. So we're in charge.
Yeah, so we need, even if it's self-deceptive, to have a sense of control, have a sense of, I know how to keep this from happening. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think it's a historical question as well. In other words, anybody younger than me did not grow up in a world in which epidemics really wiped out large numbers of people, and that I was one of the first ones to get polio vaccine, and it was really feared because kids really died or they really were paralyzed. But now nobody seems to remember that these things happen. So
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have an experience of an epidemic or something like that, public health crisis in that same way.
And if you can't see it and experience it,
Yeah.
then it doesn't register as real a threat, I think. I agree, and there's not probably just one explanation to any of these things. But my point is, despite all our great accomplishments, we're still really bad at keeping our emotions out of it and keeping just looking at evidence in as pure a fashion as we can. Yeah, I've said enough about this. Let's move on. I can harp on that one all day. And by the way, speaking of weird beliefs, when we go back to thinking about HIV and AIDS, there's some real strong resistance in Africa for the current retroviral kind of treatments of AIDS, HIV infection. And they have some very strong resistance to what we have identified as good ways of treating this, whether it be through birth control or whether it be through changes in health practices, safe sex practices, etc. They think they can treat it through, in some cases, sex with a virgin, that somehow that will protect them or cure them. That just tends to spread the disease. And even as recently as Steve Jobs' death from pancreatic cancer, he got this diagnosis and then waited 9 months because he was afraid of, just didn't like the idea of somebody cutting him open. And he chose some alternative methods. Now, we don't know that he would have survived if he had immediately had surgery, but it certainly didn't help his case. And his take the alternative approach, not trusting the mainstream science and what the doctors were saying, may have shortened or even cost him his life. You had a question?
Yeah, just to go back to the previous slide, I think that actually, well, not that one.
Okay.
Well, yeah, that one. I think a lot of it has to do with we want to make sense of the things that we don't understand. So then that's why we end up finding these things that aren't correlated.
Yeah, and I heard somebody point out that we also may have a particular propensity to fear things that seem to be invading us. You know, like a vaccine is maybe different than some other kinds of things that we aren't as fearful of because it's injecting some foreign substance into us. And we're perhaps more wired up to think of that as something to be avoided rather than other kinds of medical healing touch, acupuncture. Well, that is kind of invasive too, but you get the idea. Yes?
That would go along with the terrorism, because it's a foreign substance that's being introduced into a controlled system.
Right.
It's the same kind of just internal to the body rather than.
It's more tangible too. It's easier to picture and imagine, ooh, that's going inside of me, that's bad, as opposed to something a little bit more ethereal. Yeah. All right. So I think, and the way I put it is a kind of conceit. I think we as humans are loath to give up a good explanation once we have it. We need that sense of control. We need a sense of rightness about ourselves. We're always wrong. That tends to undermine our self-confidence, undermine our sense of control, creates the fear that I was talking about earlier that we so much want to avoid. Another example of this, an old one, from Semmelweis in 1846, he noticed that there were mothers dying at very high rates in certain hospitals and not others. For example, it was 5 to 10 times higher if you were having your baby delivered by a doctor or one of his medical students than if you had it delivered by a midwife, which strikes me as, and him, as kind of odd. Why would that be? And he started to figure this out. He said, well, let me think about what doctors do. The doctors at the day in 1846 may have gone straight from working in the cadaver lab or working with some really grotesque patient with all kinds of disease, right to going to the delivery room and working with the mother without ever washing their hands. Okay? Whereas the midwives would not have done anything else other than deliver the baby. And so mothers were dying because of infection, what they call childbed fever, at very high rates, sometimes as high as 30% in some medical facilities. So Semmelweis said, I want my students and I just to wash our hands before every procedure. And it went down dramatically. Here's the problem. He pointed out the results. He had data to back himself up. None of the doctors believed him. They refused to accept it. It took 30 years after his correct diagnosis of the problem and data to support his point before they changed their practices. And when you think about it, that's amazing stubbornness amongst the elite intellectual minds of the day. But they refuse to believe it. And one of the reasons that is often given for why they refuse to believe it is think about what that would do to a doctor to say, you mean it was my hands that caused her to get sick? It was my actions that caused the problem? And rather than recognizing that, they decided, that can't be it. I can't have caused that trouble. We are more likely to be rationalizers, justifying our actions, than we are to be rational thinkers. And I think that's a key part of every human existence, not just the people in 1846. All right. I've got some pictures up here that are going to be a little odd, but here's the thing about the human brain. I'm going to wrap this up quickly. The human brain is basically always adding new stuff to it. The brain you've got, we have evolved to this point, not by replacing the old stuff. The things that worked back for our very distant relatives are still there. And then we've added new mechanisms on top of it. Imagine if we built a computer this way. Say, so do some calculation. There you got your ink and your papyrus scroll. Now, oh, hey, we've invented the abacus. Let's add that on. Or an adding machine, or a calculator, or your early desktop computer. I know that looks like ancient history to you guys, but with tapes and card readers and floppy disks and cassette drives, and oh, now we're getting up to the new modern stuff, to the point where you've got an Apple iPad and iPhone, and who knows, we might get to the point like Iron Man where we're inside the freaking computer. I mean, it's embedded into your head. It's like plug your brain into the computer or vice versa. I mean, who knows where this is all headed? But the point is, the way the brain evolves is you just keep adding that on. You keep having to work with the old machinery just like the new machine. And they don't always work well together. Take one piece of old machinery, which is the amygdala in your brain. It's in the limbic system. It's kind of in the middle. It's part of that fight or flight response. It's very much about fear, regulation, etc., the thing I was talking about. It turns out we have a lot more connections going from the amygdala up to the higher order cortex, right behind your forehead here, the prefrontal cortex. There's a lot more of it going that way in communication than wiring going the other way, from the cortex back to the amygdala. So if you just look at how our brains are wired up, it's not very surprising that our emotions often override our higher order rational thinking. And as it turns out, our higher order rational thinking depends on our emotional reactions. Because they have had to work together and evolve to work together. If you take some people who lack an emotional gut response, and we know some people through brain damage where that's the case, they have complete inability to make a decision. It's called executive dysfunction. They can't make the simplest choices. So our brains have evolved to be emotional and rational, and we're going to just have to live with that, and live with the fear, and try to cope with that. What I would suggest is that we're going to have to evolve cultures to try to override what we learned about the brain and what we continue to learn about the brain. And we're going to have to figure out how to cope with our shortcomings. We're not the only creature that's wired up not to do very well in this world. I'm going to end on a couple things. The skunk. It's very distinctive. Evolution did a great job with the skunk. It's very distinctive, right? It's got that big white stripe. And it's got a great defense mechanism. A predator comes running at it, all it does is turn, lift its tail, and sprays this incredibly foul odor at it. That is so noxious that it will deter most predators from gobbling it up. Run, get away. And next time it sees that white stripe, it's going to think twice. Now, as well as this skunk has evolved, it's not very well adapted when it's crossing the road and along comes a Honda Civic. And it sits there and it turns and it raises its tail and sprays. The Honda's not going to care. Okay? So, again, like the skunk, we may have evolved to not be particularly well suited to the world that we ourselves are building. On the one hand, we've got this great brain power where we kept changing things. On the other hand, we've got this brain that's like, I can't keep up. I can't change fast enough to adapt to this world. The one thing our brains got that helps us is the ability to learn from experience, culture. Every time you got a newborn, it learns from what we have learned before. So we've only got, what, maybe 5,000 years of recorded history, something like that. And look how much we've accomplished and changed in 5,000 years. And the good news is cultures have evolved. Things are less warlike and primitive and screwed up than they were even just 100 years ago. Look at the racism and sexism that we had 100 years ago compared to today. It's still around, but things get better because of cultural changes, not because of brain changes. So we've got to recognize our limitations, and we've got to maybe change our cultures to make us better decision makers. Here's one simple one to go back to a health issue, and this will be my last thing. Every year people die because they can't get an organ to replace a sick or ailing organ. And people die just on the organ donation waiting list or organ donor list. In some cultures in Europe and across the world, we see very high rates of organ donation, over 90%. In a lot of others, it's 27% or all the way down to 4%. We're more in the United States like this group. You know what the difference is between these countries?
Selfishness.
Nope.
Voluntary?
Good guess. Say it.
Is it voluntary or you're?
It is
you're
voluntary,
presumed?
but it's a slightly different version of voluntary. Here, instead of marking a box on your thing that, yes, I want to be an organ donor, in these countries you have to mark the box to say, no, I don't want to be an organ donor. You can still choose, but the default is, yes, you will donate your organs if the situation occurs. In these, it's just the opposite. You have to choose by just taking the time to mark the box. Yes, I would like to be an organ donor. And look at the huge rates of difference in terms of how many organs are available just because of that. Well, knowing how silly human beings are, why don't we construct things to kind of make us smarter decision makers? And there's so many other ways in which we could try to do that. Look at the way we react emotionally, lazily, in cognitive deficient ways, and try to nudge our culture in such a way that we will look smarter in the end result. Okay, that's all I got.
That's funny.